Shaun Haney here with RealAgriculture.com and RealAg Radio, Rural Radio 147, Sirius XM. I'm looking forward to another geopolitical chat with Jacob Shapiro of Cognitive Investments. Hey, Jacob, how are you doing today?
This is the part of the year where it's not so good to live in the southern part of the United States. It is so hot outside. I can't believe it. Good to see you, Shaun.
Yeah, your summer is like a Canadian winter. And when I mean, obviously different temperatures, but it's where you want to stay in the house, man. You don't want to go outside.
I grew up in the South. I grew up in Georgia, rural Georgia, on a small farm. I famously wouldn't turn on the AC until it was 95 degrees, and I'd go for runs in 100-degree heat. Even I, who have a high heat tolerance, this summer has been stupid. It started in June. It's heat indices of 115, 116 with really high humidity. It just sucks. I can't wait for fall.
Yeah, exactly. I hear you. Okay, we got lots to dive into here. Let's start with Russia, Ukraine. Give us an update on what is exactly happening here, as we saw a major port, Danube port, that was hit last week, I believe. What's the status of this conflict?
Yeah, there's so much to get into here, Shaun. And Russia continues to be a source of humble pie consumption for me, because I just have not been able to get Russia right at just about any phase of this conflict. I didn't think they were going to invade. I didn't think their army was going to suck. Then I didn't think they were going to leave the Black Sea Grain Initiative. In some ways, I feel like the tail is wagging the dog here, as we say down in the South. But look, what happened is that Ukraine began its counteroffensive. In the midst of the counteroffensive, you had the Prigozhin mutiny, revolt. Who knows what's going on there? So we had questions about, whether the Kremlin was going to survive. Then the Kremlin survives. The Ukrainians don't feel comfortable pushing the offensive. So instead of big strategic changes, we're talking about, gritty fights that are measured in square kilometers rather than any huge change on the battlefield. And then finally, Russia decides to leave the Black Sea grain deal, and they threatened it several different times. They actually did leave it last November, and they were forced back into it because of so much pressure from other parts of the world. This time they actually left, and not only did they leave, they started bombing port infrastructure in Odessa. They started bombing infrastructure that connects Ukraine to the Danube on the border with Romania. And this is another thing I got wrong. I didn't think the Russians had any precision-guided munitions left to do that, but they proved me wrong there. I dismissed a contact of mine who said they were going to hit some of those way stations between Romania and Ukraine. They hit them, and they showed the ability to hit them. At the same time, you sort of had this, this big move up in grain prices for a week or two because of, oh my God, Odessa is going, and it's the Danube route is going to close and things like that. And of course, the hysteria never actually ends up in the doomsday column, or I should say reality never ends up in the doomsday column. The hysteria is overplayed. Ukraine is still getting grain out. In just sort of the last week or two, you've got Russia getting castigated by African countries saying you have to go back to the grain initiative. You even have China coming out and saying, well, we would also like to see a return to the grain initiative. Putin and Erdogan are supposed to be talking later this week. The attacks, for now at least, on Odessa and the Danube ports have died down. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are pushing on a few axes with their counteroffensive, and also apparently hitting Moscow with drones. So you throw all of this in, and then just throw in a couple. Prigozhin is still wandering around Belarus, apparently. He's remarkably still alive. Saudi Arabia, of all countries, is hosting a peace conference for the Russia-Ukraine war that Russia's not even going to attend. And then even you have U.S.-Russia top-level contacts for the first times in months. So it's uncertainty, it's volatility. My working model right now is that I think Russia's going to go back to the grain deal. I don't think that Russia can take sort of the hit to its popularity or to its legitimacy in the global South, because the global South is the part of the world that gets screwed by Russia doing what it's doing. I think you're already seeing them put pressure on Russia. If China also really meant what it said, I doubt that Russia's going to hold out for that long. But Russia at least showed, hey, we have this capability. We can hit this if you want to. And by the way, we increased grain prices for a while and exported some Russian grain, our record high crops here at a fairly decent price at a time that we need currency. So maybe you should deal with us a little bit more seriously and listen to us. I think that's what's going to happen. But, Putin has shown to me at least I won't say Putin is not a rational actor. I am not able to access whatever rational compass Putin is using. What I would describe as rationality is not what is passing for rationality in the Kremlin. So
I think there's a lot of people living in that world. You're not alone, Jacob. So what has been Russia's military failure? How, because when this first started, you referenced it. There was a lot of people saying this this could be like not very good from a, Russia could just mow through this war. That has not been the case. So what exactly was there a strategic mistake, or did we underestimate the resolve of the Ukrainians? What's happened here?
With the caveat that I'm not a weapons specialist or a military specialist, so I know enough to be dangerous, but to take some of what I'm saying with a grain of salt. But there's a couple different things that show us that they didn't do a particularly good job. The first, I think, comes down to Putin was trying to preserve the element of surprise, and he didn't really trust anyone, and he kept everything close to his vest. And I think most of the Russian security establishment, like me, didn't think Russia was going to invade. I think they thought it was all for show. And when the orders actually came down to invade, it was, okay, we got to scramble, we got to get things together. Things weren't very well planned. And then you had a Ukrainian enemy that was more well organized than the Russians were going to give it credit for, and wasn't just going to allow that blitzkrieg. So I think part of it was a lack of preparation on Russia's side. The second thing, and if you go back to Russia's invasion of Georgia, you can sort of think of that as a rehearsal for what they're doing right now. One of the big things that happened with the Russian invasion of Georgia, Russia obviously won that conflict, took over South Ossetia, or whatever those breakaway regions are called. But during that fighting, it became clear that Russia had some real problems with its military forces, specifically in the communication between air forces and land forces. So they just couldn't get their air and land forces on the same wavelength. You couldn't move forward with the armor and get the air power to come in and support, because they just weren't communicating. And the Russians spent billions, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars supposedly fixing all these different problems and modernizing infrastructure and promoting, generals through a meritocratic program rather than just through, corruption and things like that. And you get to the invasion of Ukraine, and it's the same stuff. They literally can't get the air power to coordinate with the tanks. And so you've got tanks that are getting stuck, hitting by the Ukrainian forces. The Russian Air Force, even though it is much more sophisticated than the Ukrainian Air Force, can't control the skies, can't control the ground. So there's something about that air-land coordination that Russia has not been able to master in general. Now, that said, one of the hallmarks of a good, successful modern army is that you can take a loss and you can regroup and you can re-strategize. And that is what Russia has done since that first opening of the conflict. They basically said, okay, our goal was to take out Kyiv. That didn't work. Now we're going to take over these parts of eastern Ukraine. We're going to make it a defensive war, an attritional war, and we're just going to sit here. And all the things that worked against us in the invasion will work against the Ukrainians in a counteroffensive, and we can outlast them. We have more manpower. We are going to sit here, and we're going to deal with that war of attrition. And that's where the conflict is right now. So you've got Russia grinding down into really the only type of war it's ever really been good at, which is attritional warfare. And you're getting Ukraine armed with Western technology, trying to push against it. But Ukraine also, remember, Ukraine was a Soviet state. The military doctrine is actually probably more similar in their heads to what the Russians are preaching, rather than all these new ideas they're getting from the West. So that's a long answer to your question. But those are the two elements I think that Russia really didn't do well with. They were not prepared. They were overconfident. And then they, for some reason, cannot get this air-land equation together.
What are your sources and context telling you about this mutiny that appeared to going to happen and then didn't happen, and then, like you said, dude's still running around alive? That seems kind of un-Putin-like. Usually a Putin enemy gets a bad stomach ache and happens to be some sort of another guy died from the flu. What exactly happened there? And is there any signals coming out of that whole event that transpired?
To the extent that I have sources in Russia, and it's not like I'm not James Bond here calling up my top secret forces, but I have other analyst friends, or had other analyst friends in Russia, and they haven't told me anything. They haven't answered my calls. They haven't answered my emails. They haven't answered my text messages. Now, part of me thinks that maybe I'm just not hitting them on the right wavelength. Russia actually did pass some interesting laws where they're banning foreign email addresses inside of Russia. I'm sure there are firewalls going up. They spent a lot of money and infrastructure time building out their own internal internet. So maybe those emails are just not even getting there, or I'm not getting the responses. I don't know, but I haven't really heard anything, which, silence is also an indicator of its own. What we know is that Prigozhin is still alive, but he's in Belarus. He doesn't seem to be active. There have been all these conspiracy theories about, Putin and Prigozhin planned this so that Putin could remove the defense minister and some of these other, those people are all still in power. So maybe the conspiracy theory is true, but I've seen no evidence to substantiate that. And it seems to me like the Kremlin really was scared there for a second as Prigozhin and some of the Wagner fighters were marching on Moscow. But I don't think we have a very good read for this. I do think that Russia's engaged in a long war, and they can't exactly afford to throw away seasoned, skilled fighters like are in Wagner Group. So maybe they're going to pivot them to the Middle East or to Africa, or put them in Belarus, put them in places that they can still be useful to the Russian regime. But with the level of war that Russia has bitten off, I don't think it can afford to lose those thousands of fighters right now. So I imagine what Putin is trying to do is he still wants to use these mercenaries that he empowered, but he also needs them far enough away that they're not going to threaten the Russian state itself, and he needs to reassert Russian government control over the Russian armed forces, which wavered there, no matter what you think. So.
And still it doesn't seem to be any end in sight to this whole thing. Like the question everybody always asks is, what ends this? And that still seems kind of unclear. Ukraine runs out of money and the West stops supporting them. Like, where does this find some sort of conclusion?
Sure, there are scenarios there. So what ends this? A Russian state collapse, not unlike the collapse that brought Putin to power when Yeltsin was basically removed because he oversaw, economic hardship and a failed war in Chechnya and everything else. That's one scenario. Another scenario, to your point, is that, the West stops arming Ukraine. Ukraine can't make these weapons on their own. At that point, Ukraine would probably not be able to keep up the fight in any conventional sort of sense. Maybe it would go guerrilla style or a sort of occupation warfare type situation. But if the West decides that it doesn't want to support Ukraine from that perspective, that could end the conflict too. Maybe there is a chance that the Saudis are going to host some peace conference and everybody's going to get what they want, and the Ukrainians will accept, okay, we don't need these eastern parts of Ukraine, and Russia will take what they want and go away. It's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's on the table. But I think the most likely scenario going forward is that we're just in a grinding attritional war, and that Ukraine still thinks that it can win, in part because it feels like it has solid support from the West, and Russia still thinks it can win. It still thinks that its combination of leverage over global energy markets and commodity markets and agricultural markets, combined with a larger military force that is willing to endure more pain and suffering than the enemy is, that eventually they will win out the day, and they just have to hold out. So there are scenarios where things stop, but I don't think we're close to one of those scenarios quite yet. I think we're in the midst of that attritional war that I mentioned.
Yeah. And what was your reaction when you heard last week? I think it was actually Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley that suggested that maybe U.S. naval ships should escort some of those grain barges out of some of those Ukraine ports. Does that seem like a really good idea, or just some really bad potential outcomes that could come from that if one of those ships was actually hit by some sort of artillery?
I don't often find myself agreeing with Senator Grassley, but I'm with them on this one. Look, it's very easy for an armchair geopolitical analyst here sitting in New Orleans, however hot and sweaty it is down here, to say, yeah, run the blockade. Call the Russians on their bluff. See if they're actually going to strike a ship that is carrying grain through the Black Sea, and if they're willing to incur status of a global pariah for doing that. I don't believe that they would. That said, I'm not the sailor on the ship. I'm not the one paying for the vessel. I'm not the one who couldn't get insurance on the vessel because nobody wants to take that risk. Like, it's very easy to say, run it when it's not your skin in the game. So, if the United States military wants to take an old abandoned frigate and do something like that and make it unmanned and power it with a drone or something, that seems like a good idea to me. I somehow doubt that Russia's going to do that. But again, Russia has shown that it's willing to do things that none of us thought were possible. So maybe they wouldn't stop there either.
Let's move on to China. A lot of news coming out of China, and what I keep on hearing on the grain side of the equation is a lot of concern about demand, and that's relevant to the status of the Chinese economy. What are you seeing out of China? Is some of this overblown, or is there real reasons to be concerned about the status of economic development there?
That depends how you look at it. I'm not overly concerned about demand for agricultural commodities. China's going to consume whether the economy is doing well or not. The questions about consumption are relating to China's manufacturing excess. They've been used to exporting abroad for so long. They have excess capacity internally. They need Chinese citizens to buy all these electric vehicles that they're making, to live in these ghost cities that they're building in the middle of nowhere that have nobody living in them. Because if you keep on getting all of that unprofitable investment, eventually that will come back to bite you. The problem here is that China still is not willing, and this is very ironic, they're not willing to really support consumption. So the Chinese State Council, after alluding to their plan for months, finally released a big list of their plans to try and boost the economy. But it doesn't actually boost household incomes. It doesn't actually put more money in the pockets of Chinese citizens to go spend. It says, oh, we're going to have tax breaks on buying EVs, and we'll have more cultural and sports events so that you spend more money. And there's tax breaks on this, and you can purchase real estate where you couldn't purchase real estate before. They're incentivizing consumption, but you can't incentivize consumption with a consumer who feels like he or she does not have enough money and is not willing to go to the cultural sporting event and buy all the things. So until we get to the point where the Chinese Communist Party is actually willing to be communist and say, hey, all these wealthy fat cats on the coast, we are taking your wealth, or all of you provincial bureaucrats who have been siphoning off wealth from the system, we are taking your wealth, we are putting it in the pockets of the Chinese, peasants who are living on $2 and $3 a day. Until they're actually willing to live up to the Communist Party's name and redistributive economic policies, I think we're stuck in the situation where China's economy, this export-oriented, export more, build more, consume more, runs up against the ground of it's not productive. It's taking more and more debt and more consumption to equal the levels of growth because it's not productive and it's not sustainable. So that, I think, is the difficult position that the Chinese government has it in. But if you're a farmer right now, I don't think that actually affects things that much. That demand is inelastic. The Chinese people still have to eat, even if growth figures are not doing well. You've still got the Chinese economy humming fairly from a relative and historical perspective. So it's more of an issue for tech companies or manufactured goods or all those other sorts of things. I think for ag commodities, it's more about weather. It's more about food security and sovereignty issues and the improvement in U.S.-China relations, all of which, at least in the short term, are good.
Any signal from the foreign minister being removed? And he's also missing, right?
Well, we haven't seen him in a month. I was recording a podcast, my own podcast, with Matt Pine. I'll credit him with this. He said, there are probably two people in the world that know what happened with a foreign minister, and one of them probably won't be talking for very much longer. But look, we don't really know. He was handpicked by Xi Jinping. He was handpicked by him 6 months ago to be in this position. There are rumors that maybe he had an affair with a TV presenter. There are rumors that he was corrupt and he was under disciplinary violation investigation. All the other sorts of things. That's all sort of rampant speculation. I will say, besides the fact that he was a Xi Jinping favorite and Xi has had to pivot away very quickly, he was more of a wolf warrior. He was a little more aggressive. He wanted to push against the West. And Wang Yi, they're bringing back the predecessor. That's a stable hand. And I think you are seeing that China wants relations with the United States, with the West, to be a little bit better in the short term. And maybe that's some of the signal that we've got there. But there's no denying that this is weird. There's no denying that this is sort of a blow to Xi Jinping's credibility. And it's really one of the real first signs that we've seen of any even potential kind of opposition or fears from Xi Jinping about his place that he had to do this.
What does better relations between China and the U.S. look like? Like, because everybody comments on the ebb and the flow of that. Oh, things aren't very good or things are improving. What does that actually mean?
Well, there are a couple different levels to that. The first is, the most basic level is, are the two sides talking to each other? Can Antony Blinken pick up a phone call and get to Wang Yi, and can they have a conversation to, say, deconflict a situation in the South China Sea? Are they actually picking up the phones? They weren't picking up the phones around COVID. That's one of the reasons COVID became a pandemic, because the United States and China, for political reasons, couldn't talk to each other. Nobody trusted each other and was willing to know what was going on. If you want to go a step further, the United States was preparing this huge change in strategic relations towards China, and they were going to curb investment in China, make it very difficult for U.S. investors to even buy Chinese stocks and things like that. Well, we already know the White House has been leaking. That's going to be very, very watered down, in part because of pressure from a lot of U.S. tech companies who were afraid of what the United States government was talking about. So in tangible terms, we basically went from the United States declaring economic war on China to, hey, okay, we're going to announce some of these smaller restrictions on investment, but it's mostly business as usual. So that's another way where things are improving, where you're not seeing both sides completely go to that sort of second or third level of the trade war. And then maximally, and we're nowhere near this yet, but, if Biden wanted to go back to what he was suggesting, well, I should say what his White House was leaking last summer, they were talking about taking down some of the Trump era tariffs for a year or two on a provisional basis to lower inflation, because supply side inflation is also one of the reasons I think inflation is stickier there. So if you got some kind of, it wouldn't be permanent, but if you could say, hey, for 1 year, let's call a truce, ceasefire, let's just open it up and try and get freer trade going again. Like that maximally is some of the ways that it could look. So there's a big spectrum there. And, Antony Blinken and Wang Yi talking probably means nothing to this audience. Actual steps by the United States to lower the temperature and to say, okay, the restrictions that we intimated out a couple months ago are not going to be as severe as possible. That matters. That shows you that both the United States and China are not spoiling for a fight right this second.
Yeah, the talk about those tariffs being removed, it's kind of floated away. You don't hear a lot about it recently. It's interesting. I read the new book by former USTR Robert Lighthizer. Where obviously those tariffs were a big part of the conversation in that book, and I think he has said since that they should be doubled again. In his opinion, did you read that book?
I didn't, but that reminds me of the definition of insanity, which is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. The United States raised the trade war, and they had this quote unquote phase one trade deal, you probably remember, and it was going to result in the Chinese importing massive amounts of U.S. agricultural products and everything else. They didn't meet their quotas. Like none of the tariffs actually did anything. Go back to so in response to some of the measures the Biden administration was announcing earlier this year, China announced a couple of weeks ago they were going to ban gallium and germanium exports. Those are important metals in semiconductor manufacturing. They have a big strategic holdover. The Trump administration raised tariffs on gallium and germanium in 2018. We still have the same level of dependence on China as we did in 2018. It didn't actually do anything. So tariffs are, square peg round hole. It's one big tool that probably doesn't do the thing you're actually trying to do. It's why the Biden White House has actually been a lot tougher on China than the Trump administration, because they are really surgically targeting the areas where China's most vulnerable. They're trying to make it hurt, whereas the previous administration just said, okay, tariffs, then everything is going to set itself off. Tariffs are really just a tax on the consumer. The person who ends up paying in the end for the tariffs is the consumer, who, because of inflation or who, because of less supply or more expensive goods, like that's where that ultimately goes to.
Did I read right that Italy is pulling out of the Belt Road Initiative?
They are. I actually arrived in Italy the day that they announced that they were entering. I was speaking at a conference in Genoa, and it was the talk of the whole weekend that Italy was willing to do this. But yes, Meloni has announced that she's taking Italy out. It was very, very controversial inside of Italy in foreign policy circles about whether to do that. This is also the place where I make the tongue-in-cheek joke where who cares about Belt and Road Initiative? I hope the state of Louisiana joins the Belt and Road Initiative tomorrow, and that the Chinese build new port infrastructure down here in New Orleans. We desperately need it. And I'm happy for us to default on all of our debt and not pay the Chinese back a yuan or a cent for any of the things that they build here. I'm not that threatened by sort of Belt and Road infrastructure, but I understand that as a political signal, it wasn't the best move for Italy, which wants to be a strong NATO ally, which wants to be a strong partner of the United States, to enter in this thing that the United States has been so worried about. So yes, Italy's leaving the Belt and Road. So what? It's not that big of a deal. I mean, Japan has spent more on infrastructure projects in Southeast Asia than China has via the Belt and Road Initiative. The Belt and Road Initiative just gets a lot of hype because China wants to hype it up as their civilizational plan to connect the new Silk Road, and because we all need reasons to boogeyman China into being, the evil actor in the world.
Do you worry about Japan at all? With the aging population and some of those kinds of issues there. Now that you mentioned Japan.
Well, there are different degrees of worry. All countries have their problems, but in general, no, I'm not particularly concerned by Japan. The demographics thing, I mean, we can spend some time on demographics if you want. I am inherently skeptical of people who make arguments just based on demographics. I mean, this is one of the things that Peter Zeihan, who is, a former colleague of mine and is a more well-known geopolitical strategist than I am, he often likes to talk about demographics. But I find that demographics are very, very hard to predict, and that demographics in general are not destiny. If anything, Japan is ahead of the pack on its demographics nosediving, and that means they're probably going to invest more in automation and artificial intelligence than everybody else is, because they have to do it first. I'd also note that Japan, the percentage of the foreign-born population is increasing in Japan. It actually increased 11% year over year. That's remarkable. That's a remarkable cultural change in Japan. It's a very homogenous society, and yet you are seeing that they are trying to make it easier for immigrants and migrants to come in, and they're even trying to integrate them into Japanese society. And like I said, also, they are building infrastructure and all these different things in Southeast Asia, moving some of their factories out of China, also building supply chains in China so that they can continue selling into the Chinese market while not running afoul of the United States and others. So I don't think that just by virtue of aging, that you should count out Japan in any meaningful sense. I worry about Japan from the perspective of they are next to a country, China, which is much bigger and has a lot more potential power than Japan does in the long term. And they have historically not been very friendly. So if I was Japan, I would be pretty concerned about that. But that's why Japan has been such an ironclad U.S. ally, why they're patching up relations with South Korea, why they're investing in their own military and things like that. So
Yeah.
the last thing I just said, I work as a partner at an investment firm. We've been long Japan since before Warren Buffett was long Japan. We've been very optimistic about Japan for years now, and happy to have other folks that are on our corner. But it's because I think you're getting some of these cultural changes in Japanese companies. You're getting this real stepwise change to respond to a more volatile world. Because if Japan doesn't respond, it could be caught flat-footed and be in a very weak position.
So based on what you said there between Japan and China, is there any, well, and there's always a chance, but does that mean that Japan gets really not excited about China joining the CPTPP then? Because that was kind of the push, the reason that was pushed so much by the U.S. and Japan at the time was kind of a counter to China economically. So and China showed, I can't remember the exact technical term, but they have showed some interest in joining that trade pact. So what happens there?
They won't join that trade pact. Japan was much more upset that the United States pulled out of that trade pact than they were that China might want to join it. That trade pact was not just a trade pact. It came with all sorts of rules that you had to implement about intellectual property and labor standards and things like that. If China actually made the reforms that were necessary to join the CPTPP, it would become a more liberal country, which is not what China has done. Everybody's been hoping that China would do that as a result of its economic success, and it really hasn't. So I think that's more about Japan thought that it had this agreement with the United States that they were going to build this, broader economic order that was going to be aligned not just on trade, but all those other things I just talked about. And the United States decided to turn its back on it. So that I think was more concerning for Japan. And if China wanted to join the CP, more power to, that would mean real change in China that I don't think China's willing to make.
Hey, Jacob, thanks so much, man. This has been awesome. We've always managed to just rip around the world in a really quick pace, and I really appreciate it and look forward to our next chat.
I do too. Thanks, Shaun.